welcome to the Down the Spirituality and Science Rabbit Hole podcast number 5. The title is Just What is Christianity? Jewish Origins of a Pagan Religion. Now, before anyone freaks out, give me another couple of minutes to describe why I selected this title. So here's a book that I highly recommend. It's called Pagan Christianity by Frank Viola and George Barna. Now, the Barna Institute is best described as a Christian think tank. They are an evangelical, fundamentalist Christian think tank, and their goal is to make worship more meaningful. And they published this book about 30 years ago. It's a fairly old book, but I recommend it highly if you want to know the origins of modern day Christianity and what we do. To give you an idea of what's in the book, I've put the table of contents up beside it here. And you can see some of the topics are very interesting. The church building, inheriting the edifice complex. Edifice complex, yes. The order of worship, Sunday morning setting concrete. The sermon, Protestantism's most sacred cow. The pastor, obstacle to every member functioning. And my favorite, Sunday morning costumes, covering up the problem. And there are several other chapters. So I want to be right up front in saying that my main resource book for this podcast is an evangelical Christian resource book. So let's talk a little bit about Yeshua and his family and where he lived and how he lived. The first thing I want to say is you would think with someone as important as Jesus, we'd get his name right. Well, I can assure you, when Mother Miriam looked at her son in the manger, she did not call him Jesus. His name was Yeshua ben Yosef. Yeshua is a form of the name Joshua. Ben means son of, and Yosef is his father. Now you may also see it as Yeshua bar Yosef. Bar is Aramaic, Ben is Hebrew. They both mean son of. So, Jesus started out as being called Yesho, which is Aramaic, or Yeshua, which is Hebrew. Aramaic is a very closely related language to Hebrew, and it was the common language of where Jesus lived, and certainly he would have spoken Aramaic and most likely Hebrew. Yeshua gets translated into Iesus in Greek. From Greek, it gets translated into Isu, which is Latin. Now, Latin is translated into English, but we don't get Jesus until after the date 1524 of the Common Era. Why is that? Well, until the year 1524, there was no letter J in the English alphabet. The letter J was originally the same as the letter I. The father of the letter J is Gian Giorgio Teresino, an Italian author and grammarian who lived from 1478 to 1550. So if you get a really old King James Bible, the King James Bible was translated and published in the early 1600s, but the earliest version of it did not use the name Jesus because the J apparently hadn't become popular when the Bible was printed. You will see the Latin version of his name as Iesu rather than Jesus. Just as a heads up, I will use the name Yeshua and Jesus interchangeably from now on. Today we tend to think of Yeshua as an independent loner with a group of 12 disciples and a whole lot of followers eager for his teaching. However, recent Dead Sea Scrolls archaeology and scholarship supports the idea that Yeshua was a member of a very influential Jewish family consisting of 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. Yeshua's family functioned as leaders within the Essene community and the temple. Also, Yeshua's teachings strongly reflect an Essene Ebionite philosophy, and we'll talk more about the Essenes and the Ebionites a little bit later in this podcast. The brothers of Jesus, or the Adelphoi, as they're typically called, which means of the same womb, are named in the New Testament as James, Joseph, a form of Joseph, Simon, and Jude, and there are at least 2 unnamed sisters mentioned in Mark and Matthew. They weren't named, and it only uses the plural for sisters, but it doesn't give any number. So there's at least 2, but there could have been more. So here's a statement. Jesus was a Jew living in 1st century CE Palestine, a Roman-occupied client state. This statement contains a lot of information not well understood by modern-day Christians. The simple title Jew relates to a person's ethnic identity, their national identity, and also a religious identity. In addition, 1st century Palestine was under the cruel and oppressive occupation of the Roman Empire, which resulted in the Jews being fractured into a number of sects with regard to how they view God and the Roman occupation. This all makes for a complex backdrop to the activities of Jesus and his family. What Jewish group did Yeshua identify with? What scriptures influenced his worldview? And lastly, what religious values did Jesus, his family, and disciples hold as sacred? Over 60 years of research on the Dead Sea Scrolls has yielded some insight into these questions. Now let me be clear, the Dead Sea Scrolls are not Christian documents. They are Jewish documents, but they were written and archived at around the time that Jesus lived. So they're very influential in giving us an idea of what was going on in the Jewish community. While there were a number of Jewish sects proliferating throughout Palestine at this time, with a confusing variety of names, there tended to be 3 major groups based on politics and religious beliefs. They were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and a group of related sects collectively called the Essenes. The Dead Sea Scrolls and the books of the Christian New Testament overlap in terms of the time frame in which they were written. The Dead Sea Scrolls collection dates from about 200 BCE to 80 in the Common Era, while the New Testament collection dates from roughly as early as 45 CE to 160 CE. All the books in both collections were composed of practicing Torah-observant Jews. The New Testament was written by both the Pharisee Saul and Yeshua's Essene followers who acknowledged him as the Jewish Essene, Ebionite, Nazarene Messiah. So let me do a quick summing up here. Jesus, from the time he was born to the time he was crucified, was a practicing Jew. Paul of Tarsus was a practicing Jew, in particular a Pharisee, from the day he was born to the day he died. It is a Christian fabrication that Paul converted to Christianity. Why is it a fabrication? Because Christianity did not exist through the entirety of Paul's lifetime. Christianity didn't come into existence as a separate religion from Judaism until about 150 in the Common Era. What Paul converted to was Jesus being the Jewish Messiah. And finally, every book in the New Testament was written by a practicing Jew. Now, that may be a bit of a stronger statement than I might want to make, since a great many things are controversial about the origin of the books in the New Testament. There may have been 1 or 2 writers that might have been Gentile, but for the bulk of them, they were all practicing Jews who wrote the New Testament. So let's talk a bit about the Sadducees. The Sadducees, a sect of Jews that were priests of the tribe of Levi, and they date back to the time of the Exodus. They were influential in Jerusalem during the Second Temple period, the time of Jesus, starting from the Babylonian exile return through the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. They drew their name from Zadok, the first high priest of ancient Israel, to serve in the first temple, along with the leaders of the sect priests called the sons of Zadok, descendant of Eleazar, son of Aaron. This is Moses' sidekick, Aaron, that we're talking about. This sect, which functioned as the de facto Jewish political leaders in Palestine during Jesus' time, were identified with the upper social and economic echelon of the Jerusalem society. The Sadducees believed that there is no fate. God does not commit evil, the soul is not immortal, and there is no afterlife. They did not believe in either angels or demons. There were no rewards or penalties after death, and they did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. The Sadducees rejected the oral law as proposed by the Pharisees. Rather, they saw the written Torah as the sole source of divine authority. The written law, in its description of the priesthood, corroborated their power and enforced their hegemony on the Sadducees in Jerusalem society. During Yeshua's time, the Jerusalem temple was of paramount importance. This is because God physically resided in the Holy of Holies, and animal sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins could only be performed in the temple precincts. The physical temple and the animal sacrifices performed there was essential for the Sadducean forgiveness of sins. Lastly, the Sadducees were politically aligned with their Roman occupiers. This meant they administered the Jewish state, collected taxes for Rome, equipped and, to a degree, led the Jewish army, and regulated relations with the Romans. To say the least, they were not well liked by the general Jewish population. So now let's look at the Pharisees. The Pharisees were at various times a political party, a social movement, and a school of thought in Judea during the time of Second Temple Judaism. The Pharisees were a more scholarly movement that emphasized the study of Scripture and wanted all Jews to live by high standards of ritual purity. They accepted a larger group of sacred books, similar to the modern Jewish Bible, what they call the Tanakh, or the Protestant Old Testament. After the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE, Pharisaic beliefs became the foundational, liturgical, and ritualistic basis for modern rabbinic Judaism. The Pharisee, which means separatist, the Pharisee party emerged largely out of the group of scribes and sages intent on scriptural study. Their name comes from the Hebrew and Aramaic Perush or Perushai, which means one who is separated. It may refer to their separation from Gentiles, source of ritual purity, or from irreligious Jews. The Pharisees differed with other Jews on the importance of the Second Temple with its rites and services, and those who emphasized the importance of other Mosaic laws. Another point of separation, specifically religious, involved different interpretations of the Torah and how it applied to current Jewish life. The Pharisees also believed in the resurrection of the dead. The Pharisees are largely responsible for the oral law collected over the past 2 millennia. While the Torah remains the original form of God's law, it must constantly be reinterpreted and made relevant in relation to the current era. Modern Jews no longer stone their wives and children for talking back, nor do they kill people for touching a pig. This oral law was originally memorized by Pharisees and passed down from generation to generation. During the Middle Ages, the oral law was eventually collected into written forms through the volumes of the Talmud and the Mishnah. Think of the Torah as the U.S. Constitution and the oral law as constitutional amendments, congressional legislation, and Supreme Court decisions that interpret and add to the original intent of the founding document. So, we now get to the Essenes, who were a sect of Second Temple Judaism which flourished from the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE. The Essenes led a strictly communal life, often compared to later Christian monasticism. Essene probably derives from the Hebrew word asim, or doers, meaning doers of the law. They devoted themselves to the study of Scripture and especially to prophecy, having many prophets among them and being renowned for their accuracy in their predictions. They had customs and observations such as collective ownership of money and goods, elected a leader to attend to the interests of the group, and obedience to the orders from their leaders. Also, they were forbidden from swearing oaths and from sacrificing animals for the forgiveness of sins. They controlled their tempers and served as channels of peace, carrying weapons only for protection against robbers. The Essenes chose not to possess slaves, but served each other, and as a result of communal ownership, did not engage in trading. The Essenes met for ritual bathing, for the forgiveness of sins, as well as communal meals. They were widely recognized for their white robes. The Essenes consisted of basically two different orders. One was celibate and the other married. The Damascus document in the Dead Sea Scrolls reflects this very division into two orders, and I quote, "In short, for all who conduct their lives by these laws in perfect holiness, according to all the instructions, God's covenant stands firm to give them life for thousands of generations. But if they live in camps according to the rule of the land and marry women and beget children, then let them live in accordance with the law and by the ordinance of vows according to the rule of the law." Now, this fascinating passage describes two ways of life for those in the movement. First, there is the path of perfect holiness. The word perfect here has the sense of complete or whole. Such a lifestyle involved abstinence from many things, including sexual intercourse, which according to Mosaic law made one ritually unclean. Thus, one who engaged regularly in the marital act could not be completely holy. Therefore, the men of perfect or complete holiness rejected the married life, but the document assures them that though they have no natural progeny, they will gain eternal life for 1,000 generations. On the other hand, those who married and lived in Essene communities scattered throughout Israel, described as camps in the land, were held to a lower standard of religious behavior. It was enough for them to live in accordance with the law, which really meant in accordance with the Essene interpretation of the laws of Moses, which frequently differed from the Pharisee and Sadducee interpretation. If Yeshua were an initiate of the Essene order, it would easily explain why he never married, yet still had disciples who lived in the world and were married with families. It is correct to identify the community at Qumran with the Essenes. You see a picture of it here. The community at Qumran are the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. According to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essene Community School was called Yahad, meaning community, in order to differentiate themselves from the rest of the Jews who were repeatedly labeled the breakers of the covenant. The Essenes were vigorously in opposition to the Sadducees, on a number of topics, including fraternization with Rome, the function of the Jerusalem temple, animal sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin, and the function of the Messiah. There is much confusion regarding who was an Essene, since they were called by many different names: Nazarene, Assyrians, and Ebionites, meaning the poor, to name a few. Yeshua, his family, and John the Baptist appear to be associated with the Ebionite Nazarene sect. Interesting point here. Jesus is also often called Jesus of Nazareth, as if he came from the town of Nazareth. Archaeologists insist that the town of Nazareth did not exist until after Jesus was crucified, several hundred years afterwards. They think perhaps that there was a mistake in the writing that interpreted Jesus the Nazarene into Jesus of Nazareth, and that Jesus would have been known as a Nazarene, not as a resident of the town of Nazareth. So, to sum up, to use the term Christian to refer to the followers of Yeshua before 200 in the Common Era is very confusing and problematic. Why? Because, as we stated before, Christianity, as we know it, simply did not exist as an independent religious entity apart from Judaism before then. For most of the 1st century CE and a good part of the 2nd century, followers of Yeshua and their leadership were all Jews operating within some sect of Judaism. This means that Yeshua and his entire family were Jews. Paul was a Jew, as we've mentioned, particularly a Pharisee. The people who wrote the books of the New Testament were all Jews. The early Jesus movement was essentially a Jewish sect. Now, I know that there are still some of you out there saying, well, what about Paul? Again, by his own words, Saul, also known as Paul, was a Pharisee and remained a Pharisee until the day he died. I quote Philippians chapter 23, verse 6. I was circumcised on the 8th day from the people of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin. A Hebrew of Hebrews, I lived according to the law as a Pharisee. Also, I'll quote Acts 23, verse 6. Now when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. After Saul's ecstatic vision of the risen Yeshua, he was still a Jew and a Pharisee, but with a new worldview given to him by the Jewish Messiah as he understood the term. Saul's conversion was not to Christianity, but to the belief that Yeshua was the true Messiah that would come to usher in the kingdom of God. Saul's mission was to bring Gentiles into the Judaism of the Messiah. He did not intend to start a new religion apart from Judaism. He wanted to expand Messianic Judaism to include the Gentiles. It was a common understanding in some sects of Judaism that the Messiah would not come again only after all the world's people embraced the one true God and Judaism. Saul was expecting the immediate return of the Messiah, so he was possessed with a sense of great urgency to plant as many Messianic Gentile communities as quickly as possible across the known world. The requirements of how these Gentile believers were admitted into the ranks of Judaism caused a heated friction with not only Yeshua's family and his disciples, but with the leadership of the Jerusalem church. If you want a really good example of this, read the 1st chapter of Galatians. Paul was one angry dude in the 1st chapter of Galatians. Okay, so the Sunday school story you were taught as a child goes, Paul was a mean, nasty person persecuting Christians. Then he was traveling on the road to Damascus, sees a vision of the risen Jesus, is blinded, converts to Christianity, and changes his name to Paul. Well, that makes a good Sunday school story, but in Paul's own words, there comes a time when you have to throw away childish things. Many Christians are under the impression that Saul changed his name to Paul after his vision of the risen Yeshua on the road to Damascus. People also equate the name change with a change in personality. This is not supported by either story, Saul's original letters or the book of Acts. Saul's family were devout Jewish Pharisees, but they were also Roman citizens of the Jewish diaspora. It was not unusual for people with this type of dual cultural allegiance to use two completely different names depending on their life circumstances. Saul of Tarsus was Paul's given Jewish name, typical in a family of the tribe of Benjamin, but he would also have had a Roman name of Paulus, a Latinized Saul analog. Having different names for different cultures was a somewhat common practice during this period of time, and they probably used the names interchangeably depending on circumstances. Luke, in the book of Acts, uses the name Saul for the first 13 chapters. He then refers to him as Paul for the rest of the book. The name change occurs when Saul is on the island of Cyprus. Note that Luke has Paul having both names, not change of names. Note that the time of Saul's vision of Yeshua was about 34 to 37 AD. However, he arrived in Cyprus on AD 48, which means that he continued to use the name Saul for possibly as long as 14 years after his vision. Saul may have used the names interchangeably throughout his life, depending on who he was with and at what time. Saul for when he was among Jews, and Paul for when he was among Gentiles. In Paul's own words, what he received on the road to Damascus was an ecstatic vision of Yeshua as the seen Messiah. I'll read from Galatians 1st chapter, verses 11 through 17. For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel that was proclaimed by me is not of human origin. For I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. You have heard, no doubt, of my earlier life in Jerusalem. I was violently persecuting the church of God and was trying to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many among my people of the same age, for I was far more zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, I did not confer with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went away at once to Arabia, and afterwards I returned to Damascus. This does indeed differ from Acts, because here Paul is describing God was pleased to reveal his Son to him. No mention of blindness, no mention of having to go to Damascus as he was blind for several days. He says he goes immediately to Arabia. So there is a difference between what Paul actually tells us happened, which is rather low key, and what the book of Acts presents to us. What did exist at the time of the Yeshua movement, led by James, with other members of Yeshua's family, the disciples, and other Jewish followers of Jesus, who acknowledged him as the Messiah and teacher. As such, this movement was basically a sect among many other sects within Judaism. Yeshua, his family, the disciples, his followers, and Saul were all Jews operating within Second Temple Judaism. So at the time, there was not a Christian religion to convert to. The people Saul says he was violently persecuting was not the Christian church, as we know the term today. The Greek word commonly translated here as church, ecclesia, meant only a group of people that met for a specific purpose. In other words, the Yeshua movement sect Over time, the term did come to mean the Christian church, but it did not mean this during Saul's time. So, we're now going to talk about pagan influences on the early Christian church. And this is again from the book Pagan Christianity by Frank Viola and George Barna. We're going to look at buildings and sacred spaces, worship, sermons, the pastor, clothing, music, and holidays. Ancient Judaism was centered on three elements: the temple, the priesthood, and the sacrifice. When Jesus came, he ended all three. In Greco-Roman paganism, these three elements were also present. Pagans had their temples, their priests, and their sacrifices. It can be rightly said that Christianity was the first non-temple-based religion ever to emerge. In the minds of the early Christians, the people, not the architecture, constituted a sacred space. The early Christians understood that they themselves, corporately, were the temple of God and the house of God. Strikingly, nowhere in the New Testament do we find the terms church, ecclesia, temple, or house of God used to refer to a building. Throughout the New Testament, ecclesia always refers to an assembly of people, not a place. Ecclesia, in every one of its appearances in the New Testament, refers to an assembly of people. The first churches consistently met in homes. Until the year 300, we know of no buildings first built as churches. When Roman Catholicism evolved in the 4th to the 6th centuries, it absorbed many of the religious practices of both paganism and Judaism. It set up a professional priesthood. It erected sacred buildings, and it turned the Lord's Supper into a mysterious sacrifice. When Jesus was on earth, he made some radically negative statements about the Jewish temple. With Jesus' coming, God the Father would no longer be worshipped on a mountain or a temple. He would instead be worshipped in spirit and in reality. For the first 3 centuries, the Christians did not have any special buildings. As one scholar put it, the Christianity that conquered the Roman Empire was essentially a home-centered movement. Meeting in homes was a conscious choice of the early Christians. They were simply homes that had been refurbished to accommodate larger assemblies. In the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, a shift occurred. The Christians began to adopt a pagan view of reverencing the dead. The focus was on honoring the memory of the martyrs. Christian funeral and the funeral dirge came straight out of paganism in the 3rd century. 3rd century Christians had 2 places for their meetings: their homes and the cemetery. They met in the cemetery because they wished to be close to their dead brethren. Since the bodies of the holy martyrs resided there, Christian burial places came to be viewed as holy spaces. Building a shrine over a burial place and calling it holy is also a very pagan practice. Following his mother Helena's trip to Jerusalem in AD 327, Constantine began erecting the first church buildings throughout the Roman Empire. Constantine built his first church buildings upon the cemeteries where the Christian held meals for the dead saints. Many of the largest buildings were built over the tombs of the martyrs. This practice was based on the idea that the martyrs had the same powers that they had once ascribed to the gods. The church edifice built under Constantine were patterned exactly after the model of the basilica. These were the common government buildings designed after Greek pagan temples. Basilicas served the same function as a high school auditorium does today. They were wonderful for seating passive and docile crowds to watch a performance. This was one of the reasons why Constantine chose the basilica model. To put it bluntly, the church buildings of the Constantinian and post-Constantinian era essentially became holy shrines. The Christians embraced the concept of the physical temple. They imbibe the pagan idea that there exists a special place where God dwells in a special way, and that place was made with human hands. To put a finer point on it, the church building is based on the benighted idea that worship is removed from everyday life. The church building is not designed for intimacy nor fellowship. This arrangement makes it nearly impossible for one worshiper to look into the face of another. Instead, it creates a sit and soak form of worship that turns functioning Christians into pew potatoes. These church buildings teach us a number of bad lessons that run contrary to New Testament principles. They limit the involvement of and fellowship between members. Often their grandeur distances people from God rather than reminding them that Christ indwells in each believer. So now we come to worship. Despite slight variations, the order of worship is essentially the same in virtually all Protestant churches. Look again at the order of worship. Notice that it includes a threefold structure: singing, the sermon, and then the closing prayer and more songs. The Protestant order of worship has about as much biblical support as does the Roman Catholic Mass. Both have few points of contact with the New Testament. In effect, the Catholic Mass that emerged in the 6th century was fundamentally pagan. Christians incorporated the vestments of the pagan priests, the use of incense and holy water in the purification rites, the burning of candles in worship, and the architecture of the Roman Basilica. Everything centers on and leads up to the moment when the priest breaks the bread and gives it to the people. To the medieval Catholic mind, the offering of the Eucharist was a re-sacrificing of Jesus Christ. Luther made preaching, rather than the Eucharist, the center of the Protestant gathering. The pulpit is the throne of the Protestant pastor. For this reason, ordained Protestant ministers are routinely called preachers. In sum, the major enduring changes that Luther made to the Catholic Mass were these. 1. He performed the Mass in a language of the people rather than in Latin. 2. He gave the sermon a central place in the gathering. 3. He introduced congregational singing. 4. He abolished the idea that the Mass was a sacrifice of Christ. And finally, 5. He allowed the congregation to partake of the bread and the cup rather than just the priest partaking of it, as was the Catholic practice. And then comes John Calvin. Probably the most damaging feature of Calvin's liturgy is that he led most of the service himself from the pulpit. Christianity has not yet recovered from this. Today, the pastor is the MC and CEO of the Sunday morning church service, just as the priest is the MC and CEO of the Catholic Mass. Another feature that Calvin contributed to the order of worship is the somber attitude of many Christians are encouraged to adopt when they enter the building. The atmosphere is one of a profound sense of self-abasement before a sovereign and austere God. In America, the frontier revivalist mode of worship is king. To the mind of a frontier revivalist, nothing beyond salvation was involved in God's plan. Pastors who gear their Sunday morning sermons exclusively toward winning the lost still reflect the revivalist influence. The influence has pervaded the majority of today's television and radio evangelism. American frontier revivalism turned church into a preaching station. Pragmatism, an approach that assesses the truth of meaning of theories or belief in terms of their success or their practical application. Pragmatism itself is unspiritual, not just because it encourages ethical considerations to be secondary, but because it depends on techniques rather than on God to produce the desired effects. Unfortunately, pragmatism, which is basically, if it works, let's do it. Pragmatism is not based on a biblical principle or spirituality. yet it governs the activity of many present-day churches. All of these methods have met fierce opposition by those who would argue today that they are psychologically manipulative. These unbiblical features in their order of worship are officiated and directed by a clergyman. They make the sermon central, and the people are passive. It does not lead to the spiritual growth that God intended. You are forced to be a muted, staid pew holder. You are prevented from being enriched by the other members of the body, as well as being unable to enrich them yourself. The Sunday morning service is shamefully boring. It is without variety or spontaneity. It is highly predictable, highly perfunctory, and highly mechanical. There is little in the way of freshness or innovation. Worship actually hinders spiritual transformation. It does so because 1, it encourages passivity, 2, it limits functioning, and 3, it implies that putting in 1 hour per week is the key to a victorious Christian life. And now, the sermon. I once had a friend of mine who came up to me and said, "You know, I don't know anyone that became more spiritual by listening to a college lecture." The sermon actually detracts from the very purpose for which God designed the church gathering, and it has very little to do with genuine spiritual growth. Jewish prophets spoke extemporaneously and out of a present burden rather than from a set script. It was sporadic and usually was delivered on special occasions in order to deal with specific problems. It was extemporaneous and without rhetorical structure. It was most often dialogical, meaning it included feedback and interruptions from the audience, rather than monological or a one-way discourse. The Christian sermon was borrowed from the pagan pool of Greek culture. The ancient Greeks and Romans viewed rhetoric as one of the greatest forms of art. The original proclamation of the Christian message was a two-way conversation. But when the oracular schools of the Western world laid hold of the Christian message, they made Christian preaching something vastly different. Oratory tended to take the place of conversation. The greatness of the orator took the place of the astonishing event of Jesus Christ, and the dialogue between speaker and listener faded into a monologue. The sermon makes the preacher the virtuoso performer of the regular church gathering. The congregation degenerates into a group of muted spectators who watch a performance. The sermon makes the preacher the religious specialist, the only one having anything worthy to say. The typical sermon is a swimming lesson on dry land. Christians are not transformed simply by hearing sermons week after week. They are transformed by regular encounters with the divine. The sermon is now beyond criticism, unfortunately. It has become an end in itself, sacred in itself, the product of a distorted reverence for the tradition of the elders. Okay, there is not a single verse in the entire New Testament that supports the existence of the modern day pastor. He simply did not exist in the early church. Alongside humanity's fallen quest for a human spiritual mediator is the obsession with the hierarchical form of leadership. In this regard, the first century churches were an oddity indeed. They were religious groups without priest, temple, or sacrifice. The New Testament, on the other hand, never uses the terms clergy and laity and does not support the concept that there are those who do ministry, the clergy, and those to whom ministry is done, the laity. The non-New Testament concept of sacerdotalism, the belief that there exists a divinely appointed person to mediate between God and the people, originated with the church father Cyprian. By the 5th century, the concept of the priesthood of all believers had completely disappeared from Christian practice. Bishops ruled over the churches just as Roman governors ruled over their provinces. For the most part, the Christian churches associated themselves together along the lines of the Roman Empire. This not only applied to the graded hierarchy it adopted into its leadership structure, but also in the way the church divided itself up into graduations of dioceses, provinces, and municipalities, all controlled by a top-down leadership system. Constantine gave the bishops of Rome more power than he gave the Roman governors. The Christian life was now being divided into two parts, secular and spiritual, profane and sacred. The false dichotomy led to the profoundly mistaken idea that there are sacred professions, a call to the ministry, and there are ordinary professions, a call to a worldly vocation. In the New Testament, there is a recognition of certain gifted members of the congregation for church leadership, but it is something that is instinctive and organic. However, after Constantine, they patterned their ordination ceremony for church leaders after the Roman custom of appointing men to civil office. The entire process, down to the very words, came straight from the Roman civic world. Christian ordination, then, came to be understood as that which constitutes the essential difference between clergy and laity. Paul knew nothing about an ordination that confers ministerial or clerical powers to his first century shepherds, ones that he called elders and overseers. The contemporary practice of ordination creates a special caste of Christian. The New Testament nowhere limits preaching, baptizing, or distributing the Lord's Supper to the ordained. Jesus never intended any person to sport all the hats a present-day pastor is expected to wear. The modern pastoral role fosters dishonesty. Congregants expect their pastor to always be cheerful, completely spiritual, and available at a moment's notice. It is lonely at the top because God never intended for anyone to be at the top. Okay, you gotta love the dude in the center here. I'm not sure how much that outfit weighs, but I'd be amazed if he could stand upright in it. One of the more rational Protestant leaders, John Wesley, wrote against wearing expensive or flashy clothing to church meetings. He felt that it embarrassed and hindered poorer people from attending meetings. However, in 1843, Horace Bushnell, an influential congregational minister in Connecticut, published an essay called Taste and Fashion for Church Attendees. Thus was born the idea of dressing up for church to honor God. This says that church is the place where Christians hide their real selves and dress them up to look nice and pretty. As far as the church leaders, white was the color of the gods. Again, our dude in the center here is not sure what to make of that. In this regard, both Clement and Tertullian felt that dyed colors were displeasing to the Lord. Bit of a contradiction in terms here. In the place of the clergy vestments, the reformers adopted the scholar's black gown. It was also known as the philosopher's cloak. The garb of the Reformed pastor, the black gown, symbolized his spiritual or her spiritual authority. The clerical collar was simply a removable version of a normal shirt collar. It was invented so that priests, both Anglican and Catholic, could slip it over their street clothes and be recognized as men of God on the spot. So I guess you can dress up in street clothes and you whip out your collar, put it on, and do a quick healing. Anyway, Jesus and his disciples knew nothing of wearing special clothing to impress God or to distinguish themselves from God's people. During Constantine's reign, choirs were developed and trained to help celebrate the Eucharist. The practice was borrowed from Roman custom, which began its imperial ceremonies with processional music. The congregation of God's people became spectators not only in spoken ministry, but in singing as well. The first boys' choirs were actually established by pagans who worshiped Greco-Roman gods. These pagans believed that the voice of young boys possessed special godlike powers. The major musical contribution of the Reformers was the restoration of congregational singing and the use of instruments. But congregational hymn singing did not reach its peak until the 18th century during the Wesleyan revival in England. At first, the function of the choir was to set the pitch for congregational singing, but the choir, in their archaic clerical clothes, were now standing with the clergy in front of the people. Today, the guitar replaced the organ as the central instrument that led worship in the Protestant church. Although patterned after the rock concert of secular culture, the worship team has become as common as the pulpit. When worship songs can only be announced, initiated, and led by the talented, this element of the service becomes more like entertainment than corporate worship. It robs God's people of a vital function, to select and lead their own singing in the meetings, to have divine worship in their own hands, to allow Jesus to direct the singing of his church rather than have it led by a human facilitator. So we're going to end with some fun stuff. Christian pagan holidays. Now, certainly birthdays and Christmas are genuine pagan holidays, so much so that there are denominations of Christians that will not celebrate birthdays and Christmas. The Jehovah's Witnesses comes to mind. Birthdays developed in Rome around Augustus, who, since Augustus was emperor and declared God, his birthday should be a holiday for all. So the practice of celebrating someone's birthday comes from the practice of celebrating the divine emperor's birthday. Christmas is a mere extension of birthdays in that no one knows when Jesus was born. There's no documentation of what time of year it was. But what happens in the winter is that the sun is headed south. It's disappearing to the south, and people back in medieval times were not sure that it would come back again. So the shortest day of the year is around the 22nd or so of December. There's a period of 4 days there where the sun appears to stop, and then finally it starts to come back. And this is cause for a great celebration. And since Jesus didn't have a birthday, the Christian Church decided that we'll put Jesus' birthday at right after the shortest day of the year because everyone's bummed out in the winter and depressed. So let's have a massive holiday celebrating Jesus' birthday in December. Now, it wasn't all that easy because Christians couldn't quite agree when they should actually celebrate it. The major Christian religions celebrated on December the 25th, but the Orthodox Christians celebrated in January. So they couldn't even agree on when they should celebrate the birthday. Now, Halloween, or All Saints' Day, is very interesting, and it certainly is pagan because we get it from the Druids. The Druids had a very different idea of where heaven was at than the Jews and the Christians did. For the Jews and the Christians, heaven is up there somewhere. But the Druids believed that heaven or the spirit world was right alongside us. And there were places such as around running water and mountainsides that the two worlds, the world of the spirit and the world of the regular people, became thin. And there is where you might be able to glimpse the fairy folk or the leprechauns or dead people might appear in these places. But one very special time of year around the change of seasons is when, as a function of time, these two spaces get closer together. So All Hallows Eve is that particular time of year when the barrier between the spirit world and the regular world becomes very thin, and the ghosts of dead people, as well as fairies and leprechauns and whatever else you have, might actually come into the spirit, might actually come into the real world. Behind trick or treat, trick or treat originated from if you took a fairy or a ghost and tossed it a tasty treat, they might go back to the spirit world where they belong and quit hassling you in your world. So, best place I know of to end on a rather humorous note. As a final reminder, worship is not something that happens in a certain place at a certain time. It's a lifestyle.